We are here to discuss SCE and Sandia National Labs kickoff for a pilot project they're doing with the ReNCAT tool and exploring the social burden index. I will turn it over to Julian for orientation to our project, to the logistics.
Great. Thank you so much, Roseanne. My name is Julian Ennis. I'm a utilities engineer with the Grid Resiliency and Microgrids team here in Energy Division. So just as a note, on this slide, you see the link to join by computer and the event password and meeting number. You can also join this meeting by phone using the WebEx link you registered with to view the phone number and meeting information. Just a couple of notes. Today's presentations are available in the meeting invite if you follow the link above, and will also be available on our team's website, linked here. We are going to be recording the presentation part of this meeting, and we will be posting that. However, we will not be recording the Q&A session that will follow the presentation. And just as a note, while one or more commissioners and their staff may be present, no decisions will be made at this meeting. Next slide. Great, so just a few logistics here. All attendees will be muted on entry by default. Questions can be asked verbally during the Q&A segment at the end of the presentation by either using the raise hand function or written in the Q&A function. You can see instructions for raising your hand, or writing a Q&A here on the right-hand side of your screen. I will unmute you during Q&A portions if you have your hand raised, and we will ask that you keep your questions to a maximum of 2 minutes. We also would appreciate if you could lower your hand after you've asked a question, as it helps me keep a track of whose questions have come in what order. If you have another question thereafter, you can go ahead and re-raise your hand by clicking on the raise hand button again. Just as a note, closed captioning can be turned on by using the CC button on the lower left-hand part of your screen. The closed captions are pretty good. We've tested them out, so it's not like a bad TV show where you can only understand about half of what they're saying. So with that, I will turn it back over to Roseanne to introduce the agenda for this meeting.
Thanks, Jillian. Today we will have some opening remarks from Commissioner Shiroma, and then I will turn it over to Sandia and Southern California Edison to discuss the project that they have, and they'll be discussing the metrics that have gone into the project, whereby they're using the data from SCE in the Sandia ReNCAT tool, and how they're integrating that information and what next steps we can expect. And we will have a short Q&A and discussion session after that with closing remarks by the commissioner, and we will provide information on the next meeting. I'm going to turn it over to you, Commissioner Shiroma, for opening remarks.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Roseanne. I want to thank everyone for attending today's workshop. My name is Genevieve Shiroma. I'm the lead assigned commissioner for microgrids at the commission and energy efficiency, the CARE FARA ESA low income proceeding, which also provides for weatherization for low-income customers, and also Lifeline. There's a panoply of different proceedings that each of us at the Commission have, and today's focus is on resiliency. So my pronouns are she, her. This workshop, or this informational meeting, is the kickoff of a pilot project partnership. I'm very excited about this. Running Sandia's Resilience Node Cluster Analysis Tool, or ReNCAT, with Southern California Edison's community resilience metric and other utility data to examine levels of social burden during blue sky and black sky conditions. Social burden is an indicator of how hard people are working to get their basic needs met during an electric power outage. And at heart, this tool quantifies the value of energy resiliency in terms of human impact, whether it's measured by the effort required to maintain electricity during outages or financial impact of resiliency measures or services lost due to power shutoffs. This desktop application provides decision support for stakeholders, including to identify potential portfolios of tools within a community, to set up communities that maximize residents' access to critical services in an equitable way. This application looks to also minimize investment costs needed to address resiliency and the need for resiliency measures. I want to thank Energy Division staff for organizing today's informational meeting. And they are comprised from our Microgrids team. Each of them have their own panoply of different proceedings and efforts that they are supporting. We have our supervisor, Jason Ortego, analyst Roseanne Rekovich, and utilities engineer Julian Ennis. I would also like to thank Anna Brockway and Martin Bleck, I'm hoping I'm pronouncing this right, Martin Blegich at Southern California Edison, and Olga Hart and Amanda Wachtel and Daryl Melander at Sandia National Lab for presenting today. Look forward to the presentation and the comments and questions. I'll hand the microphone back to you, Roseanne. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. So to put this workshop into the context of what problem we're trying to solve, we're looking at how we can optimize grid investments to maximize equitable resiliency while maintaining reliability standards, state clean energy goals, and affordability. The CPUC does not yet have an established definition or standard of resiliency that applies to our grid planning process, and there's no established methodology for valuing resiliency as a grid service. Energy Division staff seeks to address these gaps by defining grid resiliency and developing a holistic, scalable, problem-solving approach to building resilient grid infrastructure that could be applied to existing processes. We can't know how to do this without looking at the difference between quantifying and valuing resiliency. Quantification is looking at the numbers, such as the marginal cost of reducing the risk of outage. Valuation is understanding what this risk reduction is worth relative to other solutions that have different human impacts. Energy Division staff has been conducting workshops aimed at diving deeper into some of the more complex aspects of this differentiation and how to apply it to policy. In the past year, we've held 3 sessions. The interruption cost estimate calculator and the power outage economic tool are tools that have been developed to look at resiliency from a more top-down econometric perspective. Sandia did a deep dive on the ReNCAT and social burden index last year around this time, which led to this pilot project we'll be discussing today. And Lumen Energy Strategies led the first of 3 sessions that look at resiliency standards such as definitions, metrics, and methodologies. After this session, we'll have 5 more scheduled throughout the rest of the year. We will have Lawrence Berkeley National Lab reporting on their data schema pilot project, looking at bidirectional communication possibilities between jurisdictions. Lumen will continue their series covering resiliency metrics and also methodologies. We will have a presentation from San Diego Gas and Electric and Santa Rosa Junior College using the 4-pillar methodology as a use case demonstration at the utility level and behind the meter campus level applications. And then we will have some final reporting on this pilot project from Sandia and SCE. I will now turn it over to Olga for the presentation.
Thank you so much, Roseanne, and thank you, Commissioner, for the introduction and the context setting. So we are actually going to be tag teaming this presentation between Sandia staff and California Edison staff. So if we can move on to the next slide, please.
Olga, my audio, you're a little bit faint.
Thank you. I'll speak up. Is this a little bit better?
It is. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you. All right, so to provide a brief outline for the agenda today, we're going to briefly summarize once again the project partnership, specifically the motivation and the purpose and the project scope. And then we're going to do a deeper dive on the two metrics that we'll be discussing the integration of today. So from the Sandia side, that's going to be the social burden metric, and from Southern California Edison, the community resilience metric. And then we're going to be wrapping up, holding questions and discussion until the end. Next slide, please. And one more. All right. So both the commissioner and Roseanne provided, a very good introduction to this project. To reiterate, this is a three-way collaboration between Sandia National Laboratories, Southern California Edison, and the California Public Utilities Commission. So in this project, we are investigating and trying to advance how utilities can consider resilience needs within other current infrastructure investment planning frameworks. So we are partnering, three organizations are teaming up to partner on a project that is going to test the use of Sandia's social burden metric in California in a pilot project. Some of our expected outcomes from this work is identifying use cases for the metric, documenting the benefits and potential drawbacks of its application, and then understanding some of the nuances of how these use cases might play out. Some of those use cases might include things like informing investor-owned utilities during grid planning, informing stakeholders and the public about how projects are prioritized, or allowing the California Public Utility Commission to assess regulatory considerations, including some equity action items. Next slide, please. So certain things are in scope of this project while others are outside of this. So Roseanne mentioned, many of the dimensions. Oh, if we could go back one more slide. There are many dimensions to grid and energy planning. There's decarbonization and sustainability, affordability, reliability. This project specifically and its metrics focus on resilience and equity. So the social burden metric specifically is an equitable resilience metric. So in scope, resilience and equity; out of scope, other dimensions like affordability, decarbonization, etc. The scope of this project includes advancing how we can inform decision-making. However, outside of the scope would be making any sorts of investment decisions or regulatory decisions. So the purpose of this is to come together, identify how decision-making can be supported, but it's not to actively make any decisions over the course of this collaboration. Next slide, please. So, perfect, thank you. So now we're going to provide a little bit of an overview, a refresher on the social burden methodology and the framework. Sandia presented, as Roseanne mentioned, at about this time last year on ReNCAT, the Resilient Node Cluster Analysis Tool, and the social burden metric and methodology. But as a refresher, the social burden metric was developed at Sandia National Labs. It's a measure of equity in critical service availability versus the baseline capacity of a population to go forth and collect or purchase those critical services. It's also a measure when it's applied in a comparative sense, comparing a blue sky scenario when the grid is powered, all facilities are receiving power, everything is online, to a black sky scenario when part or all of the grid is down and some or all facilities are offline. So that relative comparison can also provide a measure of resilience or community resilience to a disruption in service access. So if we move on to the next slide, please. So when we dig in a little bit deeper, what is social burden exactly? It is a measure of effort relative to ability. So in the effort category, we are asking how difficult is it for individuals within a study area, within a service territory, to obtain critical services. And when we compare that to their ability, we're looking at both the availability of the services to begin with. So are you in a food desert? Are you in an area that has lots of varied and high quality supermarkets, for instance? And the baseline capacity of the population. So how equipped are different individuals within the larger study area to expand that additional time and money and effort to go out and obtain those services? The social burden metric goes beyond just one service. So I use the USDA food deserts as an example. Many of us are pretty familiar with, but we are actually looking at a full suite of critical services. So what are some of those day-to-day services that we all require for his physical and mental well-being? Food is one, clean water, sanitation, medical care, shelter, communications, financial institutions. The list is actually goes much further beyond just food access. Total burden can be combined across all of those different critical service categories, or it can be disaggregated. So we can look at just the burden associated with food or communication or medical care, etc. And we can also disaggregate it to look at a more nuanced look of how different individuals or different households within an area are burdened relative to one another. So this metric, in short, provides a way to quantify, compare, and make decisions. Next slide, please. So how does burden increase or decrease? So it increases the further you are from facilities. So if you live in an area where the nearest grocery store is 10 miles away, you are going to be more burdened when it comes to obtaining that critical service of food access than you would be if that grocery store was closer. Burden decreases with additional facilities. So the more redundancy, the more facilities there are near you, the lower your burden. It also decreases with ability. So this is our consideration or nod to equity rather than just equality. So we're not looking simply at how far are you from your nearest grocery store, but also how able are you or how burdened would you be by traveling. So we have typically looked average household income as an equity or an ability criterion, but other ways to look at it might be advanced age or mobility issues or access to cars versus public transportation. Coming back to that note about how burden is aggregated. So we calculate per service, so per critical service burden scores for each population block. So we take the large study area, we break it down into population polygons that each contain populations that are more similar to themselves than they are to the rest of the study area. And we aggregate the burden associated with food, with medical care, with water access, etc., for each one of those population blocks. We then sum the burden across all of the blocks, and then we can also sum the total burden across all services. Next slide, please. So the impact of including social burden in planning for equitable distribution of infrastructure services. We have an example here for Puerto Rico. So on the left-hand side, we see an image that would show you what making resilience investments based on distance alone would tend to provide planning that can distribute access to these services in an equal way. But if we look to the map on the right, if we include social burden and we have a more nuanced look at ability and not just effort or not just distance, we can uncover areas or pockets of need. So on the left, were we to place a single microgrid, for instance, or a single resilience investment at in that center of the island where you see the lightest color scores, certain populations would be closer. We would assume that they would have an easier time, be less burdened. But when we include that more nuanced social burden classification or metric over on the image of the right, we actually see that certain municipalities, certain portions of Puerto Rico are more burdened. They may have more transportation challenges. They may have a lower household income. So we would be prioritizing those areas over ones that are simply closer or further away from services. Next slide, please. So to summarize some of the key attributes of the social burden metric when it comes to resilience and equity planning are that it is a spatially explicit metric, so we can apply it to really drill down into where are those areas of greater or lesser need. It's consistent, so really no metric is objective, but a metric can be consistent in that it can be applied the same way from project to project. It's adaptable, which is something we're going to be diving into today with this discussion of the integration of the SCE community resilience metric into social burden. It's community input oriented. So we did a quick dive into the social burden metric without really digging in too deep this time around, but a lot of the inputs around what constitutes critical services or what are key equity considerations or what are service levels that the community requires can be informed by community input. And then finally, it's scalable. So it is agnostic to scale. We can look at very large areas like the Southern California Edison service territory. We can also look at much smaller, more community-sized study areas. Next slide, please. And with that, we're going to hand it off to the SCE team to talk about the community resilience metric.
Thanks. So nice to meet everyone. My name is Martin Blagajc. Happy to be joined here by Anna, and we are part of SCE's Climate Adaptation and Resilience Planning team. So if you go to the next slide, before we get into the SCE's community resilience metric, I want to give a little background on what motivated us to create it. So in late 2020, the CPUC directed the IOUs to perform a climate adaptation and vulnerability assessments. For this, SCE studied how a wide range of climate variables, including extreme heat, flooding, wildfire, and more, would impact SCE's assets and services. In addition to understanding the risks climate would cause to our system, the direction also asked us to analyze how to promote equity through this effort. This included consulting with disadvantaged and vulnerable communities, or DVCs, along with allowing community-based organizations and DVCs to participate in the assessment. So to help us achieve these goals, the team developed two distinct equity metrics utilizing feedback that we got from DVCs and CBOs throughout the CAVA process. And on the next slide is where we sort of go into those in detail, or at least as an overview. So the first equity metric on the left-hand side here, which is the focus for us today, is the community resilience metric, or the CRM. This is a score we produce for census areas in SCE service territory, and it measures the sensitivity and corresponding adaptive capacity of a particular community to a potential loss in utility service. We'll go into more detail in this one in a minute. On the right-hand side, the other equity metric, not the focus of today, but we wanted to bring it up for background, is the community impact metric. This metric allows us to understand the impacts different adaptation options will have on the communities they are implemented in. For example, this impact could be positive, negative, or neutral, and it covers a range of areas from potential burdens placed on communities, such as road closures or long-term, new infrastructure in the neighborhood, to potential local job impacts. As we continue to develop these two metrics, we like to think of the CRM as helping us to prioritize where adaptation should be, and the CIM as helping us to prioritize how adaptation should be implemented. With that, I'm going to hand it over to Anna to go over the CRM in detail.
Thank you so much, Martin. I really appreciate that. So today, as Martin said, our focus is on CRM, the community resilience metric. And this is a spatial metric that's meant to capture the characteristics of a community that make it more or less resilient to power outages. There are two categories of characteristics that come in and essentially make up this metric. There are sensitivity indicators that are meant to capture factors that would make it harder for community members to cope with a power outage. So for example, being elderly, as an example at the bottom of the slide, might be something that would be a sensitivity indicator. And then there are adaptive capacity indicators that are meant to capture factors that can help counteract outage-specific impacts. So for example, being in a community where there's a cooling center nearby and maybe where there's even transportation to that cooling center would essentially, hopefully, help to counteract outage-specific impacts. SCE has proposed using the community resilience metric, the CRM, to prioritize where adaptations are actually built in our service territory. So if we are proposing, for example, specific adaptations or investments to counteract the impacts of climate change, we might say, okay, we want to see how these are distributed throughout our service territory. We might want to understand which of those are in communities with lower CRM scores, right? So a score that indicates that the community has less resilience to power outages. And then we might essentially use that as a factor to prioritize investing in that community first, to essentially try to shore up our systems and our services in that location. So we are essentially kind of piloting the CRM for this purpose today, but we're thinking more broadly about how can we use this metric to really understand our community's resilience in our service territory. In our service territory. And so if you can go to the next slide, we actually have on the next slide a list of the different indicators that make up the CRM. This is the first iteration of the CRM as was included in our climate adaptation vulnerability assessment that was filed in May 2022. And so the data sources and the indicators were identified through a review of resiliency for equity and resilience focused literature and pulled from California's Healthy Places Index, CalEnvirScreen, and the US Census. And as Martin mentioned, the scoring methodology and the overall structure of this was informed by workshop sessions and community participation. And essentially where we got to is that these indicators are equally weighed across these different domains within sensitivity and within adaptive capacity, essentially try to give a map of the kinds of things that might make communities more sensitive to power outages and potentially improve adaptive capacity to power outages. Now, we believe that CRM is a good metric to use as the ability score in Sandia's social burden calculation because it fulfills a lot of these same characteristics that Sandia is essentially using that social burden metric for. It's spatially explicit, it's consistent, it's adaptable, it's oriented to community input. And what we think it really does is where the ability score is meant to represent how difficult it is to reach available services and deal with sudden changes in the environment. This is a useful proxy because it's capturing underlying characteristics that represent population well-being and dimensions that income alone cannot capture. And so with that, I will hand it back to Sandia. Thank you so much.
Thank you. We can go one more slide, please. All right, so yeah, so very much to echo what Anna and Martin said, you know, we find that there's a lot of congruence, there's a lot of opportunity, and kind of a meaningful way to integrate the two metrics. So to take a step back, to review the generic definition of the social burden formulation. So right now we are looking at social burden as effort to obtain a service, and that is a matrix of people or different categories of people within a study area and the full suite of services, divided by the product of service levels and baseline capacity. So any one of these could in theory be substituted using other kinds of proxies. They must be quantitative or numeric because we're inputting them into a calculation. They must be available on meaningful spatial scales. So whatever proxies we use for example, baseline capacity have to be available at spatial scales that make sense when we are applying the social burden metric to, for instance, optimizing the location of microgrids or some other resilience investments. And they have to be conceptually congruent, which Anna just did, a wonderful job describing all of the many ways in which the CRM is a very kind of congruent measure of baseline capacity of a population. So we can move on to the next slide, please. So common implementations of the social burden metric in projects that Sandia has worked on in the past include using the distance to services for an approximation of the effort. So we're looking at the distances from the centroids of census blocks where people live to the centroids of critical services. And then using median household income as a proxy for that baseline capacity of different subsets of a population within a study area. So like I mentioned, these proxies can be tailored when needed. So if we move on to the next slide, the proposal of these two teams, so Sandia and SCE, and what we're currently investigating is substituting the CRM and its scores directly into the social burden metric, replacing other proxies of baseline capacity. And we really think that, so far in our investigations, it really seems to be checking that box. It's a composite of community adaptive capacity and sensitivity. So it's a more complete, more multifaceted picture of that baseline capacity of populations. The CRM is quantitative. That data for the CRM is available at comparable spatial scales. So they're really, that integration checks a lot of the boxes, if not all, of what is required for a proxy that would go into social burden. So if we can go on to the next slide, and we'll pass it back to SCE to finish us out with next steps.
Thank you so much, Olga. So to close out just our introduction to this collaboration, we wanted to share some of our goals for this present collaboration and the next steps that we're anticipating embarking on together here. So what we're hoping to get out of this collaboration is two different kinds of calculations. One is a blue sky social burden calculation, where Sandia is actually performing a baseline mapping of social burden across SCE's service territory, assuming there are no outages. So any service that's being considered within their ReNCAT metric is essentially assumed to be powered and available to customers. And that calculation will include the community resilience metric as the ability score. The goal of this calculation is really to help illustrate pre-existing disparities in access to non-electric services, and will serve as kind of a best case target for the level of social burden during power outages. Now, the second calculation is a black sky social burden calculation. So this would be now doing the same mapping of social burden, but now for specific power outage scenarios. So SCE is planning to provide to Sandia essentially hypothetical power outage scenarios. And in these power outage scenarios, then the spatial area that they would cover, some of the services in those special areas would be assumed to no longer be available to consumers because they would not have power, right? So a grocery store may not have power, may not be able to provide food to a customer, and so they would have to go further in theory to reach a grocery store. And so the goal of this is really to kind of demonstrate and explore the potential compounding impacts of outage locations with the underlying availability of services and population means. And so through these two calculations, what we're really kind of trying to get to here is building and exploring this tool as a potential approach to help integrate community needs and equity considerations into how we think about grid planning and the kinds of burdens that our communities face. Also to provide an intuitive, spatially explicit, quantitative, and methodical insight into existing disparities in non-electric services, and then start to kind of communicate select quantitative impacts of investments in electric and non-electric services for customers. And so with that, I think I can hand it back over to Julian for the Q&A. Thank you very much.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Anna. I'm going to be
turning it over to Commissioner Shiroma if you'd like to make some closing remarks.
Yeah. Yes, thank you, Roseanne. Thank you, Julian, and the Sandia and Southern California Edison teams, the folks who tuned in today, and your excellent questions. I very much appreciate this work, and that it really is looking at not only climate adaptation, but just really overall resiliency, equity, that is very much at the heart of the work at the CPUC, and tools like ReNCAT are surely going to help us to ensure that communities are not unduly burdened by resiliency challenges, and provide an opportunity to really look at priorities. So again, thank you, everyone. I love it that we're able to do a very technical and complex presentation, informational session, take questions, and do it all in 1 hour. So stay tuned for follow-on sessions, which may be more than an hour, but all of them very, very important and essential in advancing our learnings and advancing this work for Californians. Thank you. Thank you to our Energy Division staff, Julian, Roseanne, Jason, and the team. Thank you. Back to you.
So much, Commissioner Shiroma. On the screen, you should see Julian and my contact information if you have any questions or want to discuss further. Also on our Resiliency and Microgrids events and materials page, you will see the materials and recording. We will be posting the recording as soon as it becomes available, which should be in a day or two. And the slides are already posted on that page. Thank you again so much for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you next month.